Good morning to all of you tuning in this morning. I'm Dr. Jason Bolton, Vice President of Community Partnerships and Admissions for the Help Group, and I will be moderating today's webcast, Neuropsychological Assessments for Students Who Struggle with Learning. Since last August, we have offered 6 previous webcasts that have largely focused on issues related to the global pandemic we have experienced together. We covered distance learning during the closure of school, how parents can help their students at home, finding perspective amid all the chaos, social skills, and finally, the mental health impact of the pandemic on our youth. You can find each of those webcasts on our website at www.thehelpgroup.org. Today, we recognize that we have made great strides towards getting back to a more normal life, and we are proud to announce that the Help Group's doors are now wide open. We are excited to have welcomed our students who have so chosen back to our campuses. Like ours, many students are back to school to some degree, and more of our daily lives are returning to normality. Of course, there's still work to be done before we enjoy our lives in the same way that we did before. But we are all to be congratulated for what we have accomplished. It's now time to look ahead. Often the first step of a journey is to understand or to assess exactly where you are. Today we will focus on just that, assessment. The Help Group's Plan Assessment Center is an assessment center dedicated to providing diagnostic and developmental assessments to individuals with suspected neurodevelopmental disorders, social emotional issues, and learning difficulties. Assessments are comprehensive and are tailored to answer families and other professionals' specific questions. Families are provided with an understanding of their child's overall development, diagnoses, and treatment recommendations. In a year in which some students have struggled learning remotely, it may be appropriate now more than ever to use assessment to determine and guide exactly where your student stands. So let's talk about neuropsychological assessments for students who struggle with learning. To do that, I would like to introduce today's panelists, Dr. Karen Wilson and Dr. Claudia Kernan. Dr. Karen Wilson is the founder of ChildNEXUS Incorporated, which connects parents and their children with clinicians, therapists, and educational professionals who specialize in the assessment, treatment, and support of children and adolescents struggling with learning, processing, neurodevelopmental, and social emotional difficulties. She is a clinical neuropsychologist with a private practice in Los Angeles, where she specializes in the neuropsychological assessment of children and adolescents. Dr. Wilson is also an assistant clinical professor in the Medical Psychology Assessment Center at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. I'm personally very excited to have Dr. Wilson with us today, as she invited me recently to be on one of her podcasts. And if you're interested in viewing that, as you should be, you can find that on the website ChildNEXUSpodcast.com. Nexus is spelled N-E-X-U-S, so ChildNEXUSpodcast.com. And the episode we did together is episode 18, so she's a voluminous podcaster, and it was called How Non-Public Schools Meet the Needs of Diverse Learners. So I invite you to go check that out. Let me now introduce Dr. Claudia Kernan. Dr. Kernan is the director of the Help Group UCLA Neuropsychology Program, an innovative partnership between the Help Group and UCLA. The program draws upon resources from the Help Group Plan Assessment Center and the UCLA Medical Psychology Assessment Center to provide state-of-the-art neuropsychological assessments to children and adolescents from throughout the greater Los Angeles area. Dr. Kernan is a clinical neuropsychologist specializing in the assessment of children, adolescents, and young adults with learning, processing, and social emotional concerns. She is an assistant clinical professor at the UCLA Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences and conducts a private practice in Los Angeles, California. So we are in good hands today for sure. Like we have done in previous webcasts, now that you've heard a little bit about our presenters, we want to know just a tiny bit about you. You should now see a short poll pop on your screen momentarily. Please take a moment to answer these questions. I'll give us all just a little time to answer these questions, and then we will move along after we know a little bit about you. And just something we've learned along the way, when you finish taking your poll, you're going to have to X out of that poll. There's a little X on the top right-hand box. Otherwise, it's going to stay there the whole time, and you'll miss our beautiful faces on the screen. So, or you might want to keep it up. That's your choice. All right, the votes are coming in. First wanted to know if you'd attended some of ours before, and I'm not the best at math, but it looks about like more than a third have, and 2/3 are new, so welcome. We have we've got 60% service providers, so we have a knowledgeable audience with some teachers and parents thrown in here. And look, 2 out of the 81 thought that they should have been presenting today. So I commend you for joining us today and being open to learning. And the rest of you, thank you so much for being with us today. So we will move along from there. We at the Help Group are honored that you have chosen to spend another hour with us. For those of you joining us for the first time, and as we just saw, there are about 2/3 of you in that group. Let me tell you a little bit about the Help Group. Among other social and mental health services, the Help Group operates 16 non-public schools in Los Angeles and Orange counties, serving students with autism spectrum disorders, learning disabilities, ADHD, developmental delays, and emotional challenges. We contract with more than 80 local education authorities. That means school districts or charter schools who act as their own school district, to provide special education and related services to more than 1,300 students. Today, you're going to hear from our 2 experts discussing the uses of neuropsychological assessment. As we talk, you will still have the opportunity to submit questions using the chat button located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And in the final minutes of today's webcast, we will devote some time to answering your questions that you have submitted. But now let's start moving along. So we're going to structure this in a way where I'm going to ask some questions that either Dr. Kernan or Dr. Wilson are going to field. The first one who answers may, or the one who doesn't answer may wish to embellish or add upon the other one's answer. And then once that is answered, we'll move along to the next, and we'll just keep going through that way. Dr. Kernan, I was going to start with you and go sort of really big picture with the first question. It does look like we have a good mixture in the audience of folks who know a little bit about neuropsychology, but also a lot of parents as well. So let's start from the broadest picture and just tackle what is neuropsychology and what is neuropsychological assessment?
Sure. So very broadly speaking, neuropsychology is a field of study looking at the relationship between brain and behavior. So basically, what can we learn about the brain by observing behavior? And how can our understanding of how the brain functions inform our understanding of how people function or behave? So clinical neuropsychology or neuropsychological assessment is the application of this field. And in the context of children, as you had mentioned earlier, Jason, we use it to gain a comprehensive understanding of a child's pattern of cognitive, academic, emotional, and social social strengths and weaknesses in order to clarify diagnoses and to develop education, treatment, and intervention plans. And we use a series of methods that we'll probably, get into in more detail later, but what we ultimately come up with is a child's learning profile. And the goal is to get a comprehensive profile so you can identify strengths, so you can address the areas of weakness. And I'd like to add an important part of pediatric or child assessment is that this all has to be understood within a developmental perspective. So in other words, a pediatric neuropsychologist has to have in-depth knowledge of what skills typically come on board at what time in development and what are typical and atypical patterns of behavior. And basically, what should we expect from a child at a certain point in time? And how do we know when something is off track?
Good. So we all acknowledge we're coming off a very different year here, right? And there certainly is concern in the community that some children didn't do well, that some children struggled, and I'm sure you guys see referrals like that all the time. Mm-hmm. Pre-pandemic, you still see referrals of kids who are struggling and coming to see you. But I think this year really brings up for me more than ever, and Karen, maybe you can tackle this, what types of students might benefit from a neuropsychological assessment, whether that's, an enduring question or whether it has to do specifically with this year. What students should come see you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think if we think about, and I think about the kinds of referrals that we get in my practice and other neuropsychologists get, they typically fall into two groups. And one group would be kids who have, for example, a known medical condition that impacts brain function. And that can be, for example, a seizure disorder or a traumatic brain injury. For example, think of your student athletes who've had multiple concussions. So those might be some of the kids that come to see us because we want to know how their medical condition or how that series of head injuries impacts their thinking, impacts their behavior, and impacts their ability to learn. And then the vast majority of kids that we see are those kids who have some trouble academically or socially, or may have demonstrated some delays in development at some point. And for those kids, the assessment serves as a guide for appropriate intervention. And so the type of kids who would benefit from this type of evaluation, again, are the kids who fall into the category of having some kind of a medical condition or experience traumatic brain injury that we know impacts functioning, or those kids who are having some trouble either accessing their academic curriculum or having trouble in their daily lives, their daily experiences. And people want to have a better understanding of why they're struggling. And the reason why that's important is because we know that not all brains develop in the same way. And for some kids, the changes or the differences in the way their brains are wired impacts their ability to, again, access their curriculum, navigate their educational environment, and really demonstrate what it is that they know. And so those are the types of kids who would benefit from an assessment, those kids where we want to understand why they're struggling in some way.
Do either of you, have you started to see, or are you anticipating seeing some questions coming to you that do relate to this last year? With so many questions out there about how kids have done, do you expect to see that, or have you already started seeing anything like that?
Yeah, I think we were already seeing it. I think that there are some new questions parents are kind of asking about. And that question usually is what I've observed over the past year in terms of my child's learning, and I've seen that up close and personal, either because I've been supervising distance learning. Are these challenges with attention, with reading, with writing due to the pandemic and due to the mode of instruction? Or was there a pre-existing issue that was not identified in their school environment? And then the third group are those parents who know that their kids have struggled all along, but now they see that it's kind of been exacerbated or made worse by the pandemic, and they're concerned about that impact, the long-term impact of those struggles.
Claudia, seeing the same thing?
Absolutely, yeah. That just to expand on that sort of that third group, I think there are a lot of parents who are now wondering about learning loss, because the virtual environment has been a struggle for so many kids, particularly our kids who have, difficulties with attending. What have they lost during this time, and what can we assess their current functioning so we can make a plan moving forward to remediate any backslide.
In prior webcasts, we have also talked about resiliency and strength that kids may have developed over this past year as well. It is certainly important to note areas of challenge that need to be addressed, but we are also seeing, in the kids that we work with, some that have really developed some areas of strength that this year provided the opportunity for those things to grow. So that's interesting as well. I'm sure that you would see that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing I really love about the comprehensive nature of a neuropsychological assessment. We're looking for strengths and identifying that so we can use those to remediate any concerns.
So Claudia, it's sort of a direct question then that's sort of related to how you and Karen both answered that last question, but maybe asked a little bit more directly is what are some type of specific questions that a neuropsychological evaluation can answer?
So basically, in a nutshell, the evaluation helps you get at the underlying cause of a problem or a concern. I can give you some concrete, examples. Say, for example, there's a child who doesn't seem to be retaining anything from class lessons. That's a really common concern that we see. And, folks just aren't sure why. They may be wondering, is there a diagnosis associated with this? And, what can we do to help this child? And the neuropsych exam, could reveal a number of things, for this hypothetical child, for example, it could reveal that they have an attention problem or disorder like ADHD. So the information just isn't getting into their consciousness in the first place, and because they're having difficulty paying attention, or they could be paying attention very well, but they actually have a language or an auditory processing issue. And so they're hearing what is being communicated in the classroom, but something's off in terms of the language processing system in their brain. And that's why they're not retaining information. And then, because we always want to take a comprehensive look at things, and not just look at cognitive processes, and also look at the emotional functioning of the child. It could turn out that this child who's not retaining information is just super anxious, and particularly anxious, perhaps, in the classroom environment. The classroom environment is a place where social anxiety can really come up, or, any types of weaknesses, for example, in a read aloud can be highlighted. Mm-hmm. So those are the types of questions. As you can see, there's a wide range of underlying causes that we can get at with a sort of a specific referral question.
And are those typical of what you see at the plan center? The types of referral questions that come to you at the help group, are those typically what you see?
Yeah, that is an example. I think Karen really summarized things really well in terms of sort of the two categories or two buckets of questions that typically come to us. Again, there'll be issues with learning, attention, behavior, social functioning, or there could be, the second large category is a medical illness, a disease that affects the brain, like epilepsy or perhaps cancer treatment. And, the parents or maybe even a referring physician wants to know, what's the exact nature of these cognitive difficulties and how can we help accommodate the difficulties? So I say common diagnoses that or issues that'll come to us are reading difficulties, traumatic brain injury, histories of trauma, which can affect cognitive development, social processing. A child may have been diagnosed with autism. This is a common question. We may already have a diagnosis like autism, and a child may be in a school that's accommodating their needs associated with that diagnosis, but the educators are feeling that there are other things that are getting in the way of learning. And so they really want to understand the child's learning profile. Perhaps there might be a reading disability associated with it as well. So that's kind of the wide range of questions we see.
Sure. So Karen, how does a neuropsychologist do this? What tools does a neuropsychologist use then to answer these referral questions and conduct these assessments?
Well, the thing is that when we think about the neuropsychological assessment, people automatically think about testing, right? They think about the reading test, the writing test, the test of attention. But the assessment process is very broad, and it involves kind of multi aspects. And so one of those is sitting down with parents and just getting information from them about what it is that they're concerned about, how long it's been a concern, what they've tried to kind of ameliorate the difficulties that they've been seeing, and how that looks at home. So if parents are coming and saying, I think my child is struggling with attention because I'm getting reports from the teachers, then we're going to ask, well, what does that look like at home, at the dinner table, getting them ready for school, getting them ready for bed. So we're going to get all of that information to kind of validate what it is that what other teachers have been reporting, for example, in the home environment. And that interview is really extensive because not only do we want to know kind of the nature of what it is that they're reporting, but also what is that child's history and what does that history tell us about possible risk factors. So we're going to go back to pregnancy and birth and delivery and, what were those early developmental milestones, and did the child meet those milestones within the expected range? Because what we know from the research is that there are some things that are evident early on that are indicators of problems later on. An example would be, children who have delays in speech development or delays in language development, they're at greater risk for having reading struggles later on. And so gathering that information gives us an idea of the extent to which kids are at risk for developing neurodevelopmental disorders. And so that interview is a significant part of the assessment process. And it's not only the parents that we're talking to teachers as well, because we want to know what are the teachers observing in the classroom and, get all the nuances. So is it just in reading class that the child is struggling? Is it just when they're doing the math portion? Do you see the struggles with attention when you're observing them at recess, when they're in PE, when they're doing different other types of activities? Because one of the things we want to know is, are the difficulties that parents are seeing also seen by teachers in the school environment? And then in addition to the interview, we're making our own behavioral observations. We're watching the child from the moment they enter our office. How well do they separate from a parent to come and start the testing? We're looking at their response to completing the tasks. Because even though, at the end of the day, we're going to have test scores, we want to understand how they arrived at those test scores. And I usually give the example, we have this task where kids have to perform copy a design with blocks, and they have to do it within a time limit. Well, if we give them 2 minutes to complete the task and that child finishes the task correctly at 2 minutes and 10 seconds, they get 0 points. The child who never tries gets 0 points. And the child who tries and tries and tries and never gets it done gets 0 points. So you have to kind of observe how they got to the 0 points in order to fully understand where the struggle lies. So the behavioral observations are very important. And then we also have standardized rating forms that we give parents and teachers and sometimes another person who knows that child well, rating forms to complete so they can document their observations. And we take those standardized forms and we look at what the parents and teachers are reporting compared to other parents of 7-year-old boys, 12-year-old girls, 6-year-olds. And that tells us whether or not the observations are consistent with what you would expect, or are they clinically significant, which means that you're seeing more of those symptoms, more of those behaviors than you would typically expect to see in a child that age, and it's interfering with their functioning. And so those rating forms are important as well, because it also answers the question when parents sometimes say, well, doesn't everyone have attention difficulty? Shouldn't all 6-year-olds struggle with attention? We want to know, is that 6-year-old struggling with attention more than other 6-year-olds? Because that's an important piece. And then the neuropsychological testing, and that's when we administer tests, and Dr. Kernan described, the domains of cognitive functioning, of academic functioning, and we'll talk a little bit about, what that looks like a little bit later on today, but we're actually going in and administering some of these tests and watching the children perform those tasks and seeing how they compare not only to others their age, but to themselves. Because again, like Dr. Kernan said, we're going to get a learning profile for that student. Where are they with attention? Where are they with memory? Where are they with reading, with math, with motor functioning? And we get this nice profile of their strengths and weaknesses. And that's from the testing process. And then the last part of that assessment process is the feedback, where we sit down with parents and we go over the results of the evaluation. We talk about recommendations, what it is we're seeing, is there a diagnosis, and then what are the next steps in addressing the concerns.
That's a fantastic description, sort of you're putting a puzzle together, right? And really
yes.
Making sure you get the information from many different sources. In my role at the help group, I sit on our admissions committee, and so I'm a consumer of a lot of testing and a lot of assessment. And I'm interested in this from both of you. What should a parent expect to take home with them? What they engage in this process with you? What are indicators of a quality assessment, or what should they be? What should they leave that office with in their toolbox?
Well, I think Karen went a little into the process. I think a really important part of the process of the neuropsychological assessment is the feedback meeting. So that's where we're going to go over the results of testing. And there, we're going to clarify any diagnoses. We're going to give recommendations for interventions. And importantly, we'll provide referrals to specialists who can help work with the child on their specific issues, whether it be a reading specialist, a behavioral specialist, perhaps a psychiatrist if medication is needed. And I think another important thing, sort of deliverable for the neuropsych is a feedback meeting with the child. Because in this meeting, we can explain to them what their particular learning style is, and we can kind of prep them and get their feelings about any interventions that the parents might want to move forward with, or any accommodations that the school might want to move forward with. And then finally, the neuropsychological report is, I think, the big deliverable. We often refer to it as the roadmap for helping a child. And so that report is going to summarize all of the findings. So parents, teachers, intervention specialists can refer back to that as they're working with the child, designing interventions. It's a document that will really outline everything that we found and our specific recommendations.
Great, yeah. Karen, I know we didn't talk about this particular question in our pre-interview,
That's okay.
but any quality indicators come to you? Because parents are shopping, right? When they look somewhere to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts of like what should a parent be looking for when they're choosing a place to go to have a neuropsychological assessment?
I think one of the things to think about is, has this person have a history of seeing kids like your child? Is this, and that's something the parents can ask, do you often see kids who have struggles with attention or struggles with reading? Is this something common to the kinds of kids that you see in your practice? Or even asking, what are the kinds of kids you've seen in your practice? What are some things that you typically recommend? What does that process look like for you? And, all the things that we mentioned that are important part of a good evaluation. Are you going to be speaking to my child's teachers? Are you going to be giving them rating forms? Are you going to be doing a behavioral observation? Are you going to be observing in the classroom, or are you going to be observing them in the setting in an office? So you're looking for the extent to which the practitioner is going to be gathering information, not just from that one-on-one interaction with them in their environment, because that's just a piece of the puzzle. And really what you want to know is, how does their performance in that testing session impact their daily lives? And you get at that piece by really being comprehensive in your seeking of information from other people. And then also it's really a kind of a catch-22, because oftentimes the quality is manifest in the report itself, which you don't get until the end. And obviously because of HIPAA, you can't ask for a copy of a report that they've written, but you can maybe get references from other people who've worked with, my light just went off, worked with that particular practitioner, and who worked with that clinician before, because it's very hard to know until you've been through the process whether or not you're going to get what it is that you want at the end of that assessment process. But maybe even asking, what can I expect? And then see whether or not those expectations meet your needs. And if the clinician says, this is how I'm going to do it, and this is what you can expect, at the end of this process, you're going to know whether there's a diagnosis. And if there's not a diagnosis, but your child is struggling, you're going to know how to help them. And the teachers are going to know how to help them. And you're going to have this documented in a report. And the report is not only going to outline the diagnosis, it's going to give you actionable steps to follow up on after you're done. And so that will help you kind of figure out what that will look like for you and whether or not it answers the questions that you have, because each parent is going to come to this process with different questions.
I think that's really helpful, because I think, you listen to this webcast and you identify, I think maybe I'm interested in this, and the process is just not as clear maybe as, shopping for other things that you shop within your life, and you want to make sure that you get the right person. So I think that I really appreciate that answer. I'm sure the audience does as well. What does Claudia, what should a family expect when they engage in this process? What should it look like? What should the process be like for them? It seems like it could be a little scary. Maybe, maybe even for the younger the kid is or whatever, it might be a little bit scary. But how does it start sort of from A to Z? I hear you saying, you should end with some deliverables, but how does the process work?
Sure. So, at the help group and many other organizations and practices, it starts with, a phone call or submitting a form via the internet, requesting an evaluation, and then generally a staff member or the neuropsychologist theirself will speak to you by phone and, do an initial screening to understand, what your general questions are about the process, and then help you determine whether a neuropsychological evaluation really would be appropriate or helpful. And then if it turns out that a neuropsych exam is appropriate, you'll go ahead and schedule your appointments. And the appointments usually begin with an in-depth parent interview. And that's where we're going to really dig in and go into your concerns in more detail and gather any pertinent background information regarding the child. and then the child will come in for testing. And it really varies from practice to practice and from child to child, but typically it'll be 8 to 10 hours of testing total. It might be, 2 to 4 testing sessions for younger kids, and for kids with attention issues. It often makes a lot of sense to divide the testing sessions up into shorter sessions. And in the meantime, as we mentioned earlier, the parents themselves and teachers will be filling out these standardized rating forms. The neuropsychologist will be gathering records and reviewing them. And then, once we get all this data, we'll analyze the data and schedule your feedback meeting, which I went into a little bit earlier. That's basically where we'll cover the results of testing and provide the referrals.
So I have one more question before we get to questions that have come in from the chat, and then some that were given during registration as well. But the chat's getting pretty busy, so I want to make sure that we do get to some of those questions. But one last thing, just to sort of make this decision about seeing a neuropsychologist. I'm a psychologist, and I was trained in psychological assessment. I did a lot of psychoeducational assessment at one point in my career. Talk a little bit about why I should see you, Dr. Wilson, and have a neuropsychological assessment done versus a psychoed that you could find a psychologist to do, or maybe it might be done as part of a child's triennial review in their school district as well. Why would you make that choice, and what might be some sort of basic differences? And then we'll move on to the other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a really important question that comes up often. The difference between a psychoeducational assessment and a neuropsychological assessment, which is the kinds of evaluations that I perform. And I think that when we think about psychoeducational evaluations, we're really looking at evaluations that seek to understand a child's learning profile. And that's usually used to determine whether or not they meet the criteria for special education services in a school setting, or modifications or accommodations in a school setting, and then how to support a child who might have, a specific learning disorder. So it's really geared towards identifying how to support a child in their learning environment. And so it's typically not as broad as what would be evaluated in the context of a neuropsychological assessment. So, the person doing a psychoeducational assessment could also be a clinical psychologist. And the difference between a neuropsychological and a psychoeducational assessment and a neuropsychological assessment can often be the expertise of the person administering the testing. And so with a neuropsychological evaluation, the only people who can perform those evaluations are neuropsychologists. And neuropsychologists are clinical psychologists, the same people who do the psychoeducational evaluations, but they have additional expertise in brain behavior relationships. And so when we're doing assessments, we're looking at the assessment and the process and the results through a different lens. And it's through that understanding of how a child's brain functions and how that functioning impacts a child's ability to learn and impacts that child's behavior. So it's a different kind of way of looking at of the way a child learns. And I think we're also, with a neuropsychological assessment, we're looking at the underlying neurocognitive processes that impact learning. So with, a standard psychoeducational assessment, they're going to also look at reading, writing, and math. They're going to look at where things might be breaking down. Is it reading fluency? Is it phonological processing? Is it math word problems? Is it math calculations? They're going to look at all of those things. And so are neuropsychologists. But as a neuropsychologist, I want to also look at what are the processes that impact learning. So I'm going to look at attention. I'm going to look at memory. I'm going to look at attention to things you hear versus things that you see. Those are different processes. I'm going to look at your ability to remember information you see versus information that you hear. Those are, associated with different areas of the brain. So I'm looking at it through that lens. And that also helps us really identify and answer the question. So if a parent comes in and says, my child is forgetful, they're not retaining the information based on teacher reports, then I want to know, is it because they're not paying attention, or is it because they can't retain the information, which is a memory problem? And what I often tell parents is that kids can't remember information they never paid attention to in the first place. So you have to be able to distinguish between those two things, because the intervention is going to be different depending on what the reason is for the struggle. And the same is true for example, reading comprehension. If we're just assessing reading comprehension and we find, oh, this child is performing below expected levels in reading comprehension, and that's all that we assessed as part of a psychoeducational evaluation, yes, you'll provide support for reading comprehension. But kids can struggle with reading comprehension for a number of different reasons. For some kids, it's rooted in, phonological processing, and that's going to have a specific type of intervention. For some kids, it's working memory. They can't retain the information and hold on to that information while they continue reading. That's a different intervention. For some kids, it's inattention. They're reading, but they're not paying attention. They're thinking about something else, and therefore they're not really getting all the information from that text that they can, and that would be a different intervention. So you have to assess we look at assessing for all of the different things, so we have a better idea of how to intervene. And so when we do a neuropsychological assessment, it includes a psychoeducational evaluation embedded in it. So we're going to look at academic achievement, we're going to look at language functioning, and we're going to look at social emotional functioning and behavior. But in addition to those things, we're going to look at intellectual functioning or general cognitive abilities to kind of give us an idea of what we would expect for that child to be able to do. We're going to look at attention. We're going to look at learning and memory, like I said. We're going to look at executive functioning. We're going to look, and that refers to a child's ability to plan, to organize, to manage their time, to prioritize, because oftentimes, for example, a child who's struggling with writing, it's not actually the writing process that they're having difficulty. It's not the words, it's not vocabulary, it's not language-based, it's really executive functioning. It's being able to pay attention to all those different aspects of writing while you're completing the writing task. And through a neuropsychological assessment, if we can identify that this difficulty is really rooted in executive functioning, then that will have a specific intervention that targets executive functioning. And then again, like Dr. Kernan was saying, we're going to look at social emotional functioning. We're going to look at anxiety. We're going to look at depression. We're going to look at self-concept. And the reason we do that is because sometimes what we think is an attention problem is really anxiety or PTSD. And there's a lot of talk about post-traumatic stress during COVID because there's been a lot of trauma and associated with all the things that have happened over the past year. We are also going to look, as part of a neuropsychological assessment, things like sleep and media exposure. Those are two things that can significantly impact attention and learning. And so we're going to look at all of those things so that we have an idea of, again, why the child is struggling, and then how we intervene. What is the plan for intervention, which is the reason why parents are coming to see us in the first place.
One of the themes I'm seeing in chat questions, and I think this is pretty clear with your answer, is the question of would it be appropriate to seek neuropsychological evaluation for a differential diagnosis of ADHD or learning disability? I hear pretty loud and clear from you that is absolutely an appropriate place to go get that, right?
Absolutely. And also the fact that they co-occur, because if you're just specifically looking for a learning disorder, you might miss the ADHD, and 40 to 50% of kids with ADHD also have a learning disorder.
So I'm going to dip into these questions. It's always good when the chat starts running high. Claudia, so I'll read the question as it came. So my kids keep changing. Do I have to get them tested? Do I have to get them tested every few years so I know what's happening with them?
That's a great question. One great thing about the neuropsych exam process is that the neuropsychologist can often give you a heads up about what some of the common pathways of development are for or that are associated with your child's learning profile or their diagnosis. So you can have a plan of action for new challenges that come up over time. So often, another exam may not be needed, but cases where an additional neuropsychological exam might be appropriate are often during transition times. So, for example, a child may have been evaluated in the second grade and now be moving to middle school. And, we may have implemented a number of interventions, but now we're wondering, what does this child's skill set currently look like? And how might an understanding of that be helpful for the transition to middle school or high school or college even? And another time where it might make sense to, be evaluated again is when interventions aren't quite helping in the way that we had hoped, or maybe at the pace that we had hoped, or maybe there's a dramatic change in functioning. And we just really need an update of what's going on at this specific point in time.
And there's related questions, like this seems to be something people are really thinking about. Dr. Wilson, how early should a child be assessed?
Yeah, I think I often say the earlier the better, but not too early, because you want to give time for brain development to occur, and you don't want to mistake normal development for pathology. So we want to be clear on that. But I think the best time to have a child assessed is when you see that struggle start to impact their ability to function in school or at home. And so it seems that they're having more trouble than you would expect. Maybe you have more than one child in the home and your other children didn't struggle in that manner. So that would be a good time to really take a look at having your child assessed. It might be that you're getting reports from the teachers that your child is behind relative to their peers. And they might even say things like, well, just watch it, or he might grow out of it. And those are always red flags for me, because kids who have early indicators of dyslexia don't grow out of it. If it's dyslexia, it's going to be there and it's going to persist. And so you really want to pay attention to what teachers are saying, and then also your own observations. If your child is doing homework and the teacher says this is a 30-minute assignment and your child is taking 2 hours to do that assignment, that's an indication that they are struggling more than what is expected to get that task done. And there might be some information from an assessment would help you understand why they're struggling in that way. And again, the reason why I say the earlier the better is because we know the brain is plastic. And I don't mean like Tupperware, and I'm probably dating myself by saying Tupperware, but plastic meaning the way the brain can organize and reorganize. It does that better when kids are younger. So they also respond to interventions better when they're younger. So once you start seeing the difficulties in a child and it seems to be impacting them at home, at school, and more than other kids their age, then that's the time to get them assessed.
Claudia, there are a number of questions that are about cost. I do know that out there in the world, a neuropsychological assessment can be expensive. At the Plan Center, how do we deal with the cost of this? Does Medi-Cal cover?
Yes, yeah, we do accept Medi-Cal. Which is a really valuable, one of the missions of the help group is, access to quality care for folks in the community. So we do accept Medi-Cal. And for folks without Medi-Cal, we also have a sliding scale. So the price can be adjusted based on income.
And we'll make sure that we get some information to all of you about that. Some information about Dr. Wilson's practice, and also about what we're doing at the help group. There were a couple of questions about how would we get in touch with you. So we'll do that. You can get a hold of the Plan Center by going through the help groups, the www.thehelpgroup.org as well. But we'll send that out, because we're also not going to be able to get to every question. So we'll try to look at questions and perhaps put some answers together to send out to everybody who registered as well. Okay, so I'm still looking through here. Really lots of questions. Karen, when first of all, do you do independent evaluations for parents who want to include that in their IEP process?
Yes, I do. Yes, we do. We do in our practice. There are 3 clinicians in our practice, and we do independent evaluations.
Can you talk about how a psychologist from outside the IEP team might add their voice to that a little bit?
Yeah, the psychologist who's seeing the child at school.
For an IE.
And how they might add their voice.
How do they become part of that IEP team if they're?
So I think, well, if they've done an evaluation of the child previously, then as a clinician, we're probably going to want to speak to them about their observations. We're going to review previous assessment records, and that will give us an idea of, kind of are the results of our assessment consistent with what the previous evaluation showed? And then we're also going to look at, if nothing was found, we're going to look at what they didn't evaluate that might answer some additional questions. And that also speaks to kind of the scope of the neuropsychological assessment. So if they didn't assess attention, they didn't assess executive functioning, those are things that I would ask that person on the IE team, on the IEP team rather, whether or not those areas were assessed. And that kind of helps us decide what areas we want to focus on for an IEE eval.
All right. Getting some questions about transition from high school. Karen, I know you talk about this a little bit, so I'm going to send this your way.
Okay.
How do you advocate for your child for accommodations for life after high school, or how does that process work? So a lot of us really work with kids K through 22, and then once they leave, it's sort of a new world. But how do your services fit in with helping kids with that transition?
Yeah, I mean, we can help in a number of different ways. And I think one of the first things I often say when parents ask about advocating for their child, and I use child in parentheses as they're transitioning to college or to a workplace, is that it really has to be about self-advocacy at that point. And that self-advocacy process actually should start much earlier because, as a person, as a young person transitioning to college or transitioning to the work environment, you don't want your mom calling your professor and saying you're going to turn an assignment late or asking for your accommodations. And so self-advocacy is very important at that stage. And that means for self-advocacy, a student has to understand their learning profile. And I can't tell you how many students I've seen who don't even know their diagnosis. They don't know what's in their IEP or what kinds of accommodations, why they've needed the accommodations that they've had. And so oftentimes it's a consultation with the student who's making that transition about how much do they understand about their learning profile, how it impacts them. Have the accommodations that they've received in high school been helpful? Have they continued to need all of those accommodations? Because that can change over time. And then looking at the level to which they feel comfortable asking for those accommodations as they transition to college. And I think it also comes with the recognition that many aspects of neurodevelopmental disorders don't stop when a child turns 18, and they will follow that child, that young adult, to college or to the work environment. And so helping that young person understand how those difficulties that they've experienced in high school may manifest in a college setting, may manifest in a work environment, particularly if students have struggled with executive functioning. Because what we know about executive functioning is that it's associated with the front part of the brain, which is the last part of the brain to develop. And that part of the brain is not fully developed until individuals are like in their mid-20s. And so when you're thinking about sending a 17-year-old to college, their brain is still developing and that executive functioning system is still coming on board. And so they'll still struggle with some of those things, even if they didn't have learning or processing challenges. But the research also shows that there can be as much as a 3-year delay in the development of the frontal lobe. So what you think is a 17-year-old heading off to college may have the the frontal lobe of a 14-year-old. And so those are some things to keep in mind in terms of what support might be needed for the student that may not be needed for someone who never struggled with executive functioning or attention issues. And so those are some things that have to be reviewed with the student, have a plan moving forward, connecting them with ability or disability services at their college. Some students go in thinking, I no longer need accommodations. Let me give it a try without any support. And I always say, ask for the support, even if you don't need it, because it takes longer to get the support. If you go in, don't accept any support, have struggles, fail tests, and then have to file with the disability office to get accommodations, that can take time. So it's better to have those accommodations in place in the beginning and not use them than to need them and not have them.
Awesome. I just smiled a second ago. You might have caught it because a chat came by that said, you guys are awesome. So I agree with that. Time flies when you're having fun.
It does. I can't believe it's 11.
And learning. So we're up against the clock here. So I just thank you both, Dr. Wilson and Dr. Kernan, for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. For all the rest of you, this presentation has been recorded, and we will let you know when it's available to view and share with your colleagues and friends and neighbors. If there are questions that we didn't get to today, we will share some of the answers with those in a follow-up email, as well as some contact information that I promised. We would like you to save the date for our next webcast, which will be on July 14th, also at 10 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and we'll reach out to you with further information on that as it becomes available. There's certainly light at the end of the tunnel, and we look forward to the day when all students at the help group and everywhere else are all back learning all together on their schools and their campuses. Like I said earlier, we at the help group, we're screaming from the mountaintops that our doors are open. We always endeavor to provide the best education to our students and to impart what we have learned about best practices to parents, other schools, and other communities. If you would like to learn more about our Plan Assessment Center, our schools, including our summer school programs for students looking to bolster their reading, math, and social skills in 20 days of intensive and fun activities, you may go to our website at www.thehelpgroup.org. You can email our admissions department at admissions@thehelpgroup.org. You could even give us a phone call, 877-943-5747. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your choosing to spend your valuable time with us today. We at the Help Group are here for you when you need us. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.